This is a mistake. The words sliced through the heavy silence like a blade. Elena's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress as she stared at the man before her. Not her fiancé but his older brother. Xavier Volkov. Unforgiving. And very clear in his disdain for this engagement. He leaned against the polished bar of the Grand Volkov estate, whiskey swirling lazily in his hand. The golden liquid caught the dim chandelier light, but his eyes, icy and calculating, never left hers. Somewhere in the background the ball continued. Soft music played, couples danced, and guests toasted to a future that wasn't theirs to decide. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, her introduction as Adrian Volkov's fiancée, the soon-to-be wife of the youngest Volkov heir. But here she was, standing with the wrong Volkov brother. You're marrying the wrong man. Elena swallowed, her heart pounding so violently she thought he might hear it. Xavier Volkov, the firstborn, the heir who was never meant to be replaced. But fate had been cruel. His mother, his father's first wife, had died years ago, and in her absence the power had shifted. Adrian's mother became the new Volkov matriarch. And with her influence, the youngest son became the favored one, the trusted one, the one their father chose to inherit everything. Xavier had been cast aside. And he never forgot it. I don't have a choice. A dry, humorless chuckle. Everyone has a choice. Not me. She lifted her chin, trying to steel herself against the tension stretching between them. It was suffocating. Dangerous. Xavier's presence was like standing too close to fire. You knew it would burn you, but something about the heat was impossible to resist. Her engagement was arranged, a business deal. Marrying Adrian Volkov meant saving her family's company from the edge of ruin. It was logical. Practical. Love had no place in this equation. Yet standing here face to face with Xavier, her body betrayed her. The pull between them was undeniable, a force neither of them wanted but couldn't ignore. Adrian is good to me, she whispered, though the words felt empty. Xavier's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. Is that what you want? A man who's just good to you? Elena hesitated. Mistake. Xavier saw it. He stepped closer, invading her space, his towering frame making her feel small. He smelled like expensive cologne and something darker, something that made her stomach twist. You don't love him, he murmured. Her breath hitched. Don't lie to me, Elena. Her name on his lips sent a shiver through her. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But the most terrifying part? She didn't want to step away. Elena's breath came in shallow, uneven pulls. She should have walked away the moment Xavier spoke. She should have ignored the way his voice wrapped around her like silk, smooth yet deadly. But she stood there, held in place by something stronger than logic, something dangerous. You don't love him, he had said. The words echoed in her mind, unraveling every lie she had convinced herself to believe. Her fingers tightened around the stem of the champagne glass in her hand, as if gripping something tangible could anchor her back to reality. It doesn't matter, she said finally, voice soft but firm. Love isn't part of this. Xavier's gaze didn't waver. Then you're a fool. Her spine stiffened, heat rushing to her cheeks. Excuse me. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, unfazed by her reaction. You think sacrificing yourself for a business arrangement will make you happy? He scoffed, shaking his head. You're selling yourself for your family's mistakes. His words cut deep because they were true. Elena had spent years watching her father struggle, the weight of his failing company pressing into her shoulders. Marrying Adrian Volkov was the only way to secure their future. And Adrian, he was kind. Xavier was neither of those things. I don't expect you to understand, she said, forcing her voice to stay even. Not everyone has the luxury of choosing their own fate. Xavier's expression darkened. I understand more than you think. Something flickered in his eyes, something raw. A secret buried beneath years of walls and cold indifference. Elena should have let it go. But against her better judgment she whispered, Then why do you hate this engagement so much? Why do you even care? The muscle in his jaw ticked. For the first time his confidence wavered, if only for a second. Then just as quickly he buried it beneath that same impenetrable mask. You don't belong to him. His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words crashed into her like a storm. A shiver ran down her spine. I will belong to him. In a few weeks I'll be his wife. Xavier's eyes darkened, his grip tightening around his glass. Not if I have anything to say about it. Elena's pulse stuttered. Xavier, she warned. Do you even know what kind of man my brother is? His voice was laced with something dangerous, an unspoken truth lurking beneath the surface. She hesitated. He's kind. He treats me well. Xavier let out a low, bitter laugh. He treats you well because he doesn't care about you. The words sent a chill through her, but she refused to let them shake her. That's not true. Xavier tilted his head, studying her. Tell me something, Elena. Has he ever looked at you the way I do? Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because the truth was, no, Adrian had never looked at her the way Xavier did. Adrian's gaze was warm, polite, affectionate even. But Xavier's? His gaze burned. It stripped her down to her very soul, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. And she hated how much she craved it. You're playing a dangerous game, she whispered. Xavier took another step closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating off him. I don't play games, Elena. A breath caught in her throat. She should move. Step away. Anything to break the spell he was weaving around her. But her body refused to obey. Tell me to stop, Xavier murmured. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This was wrong. So wrong. But she couldn't find the words. Because she didn't want him to stop. And that terrified her more than anything. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Elena jerked back as if burned, her pulse racing. Xavier's expression hardened instantly, his mask slipping back into place just as Adrian stepped into view. There you are, Adrian said, smiling as he approached her. He slid an arm around her waist, pressing a kiss to her cheek. I've been looking for you. Elena forced a smile, but her entire body was still humming with the aftermath of whatever just happened between her and Xavier. Xavier's jaw clenched as his gaze flickered to where Adrian's hand rested on her waist. His knuckles turned white around his glass, but he said nothing. Xavier, Adrian said casually. Surprised to see you here. You usually hate these events. Xavier's lips curved into a humorless smile. I still do. Adrian chuckled, oblivious to the tension crackling between them. Well, try to enjoy yourself. Elena, my father wants to introduce you to some investors. Elena nodded, forcing her body to move, to follow Adrian away from the bar. But as they walked away, she couldn't stop herself from glancing back. Xavier was still watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. This wasn't over. Not even close. The ballroom buzzed with murmured conversations and the soft clinking of glasses, but Elena felt none of it. She stood beside Adrian, nodding politely as he introduced her to another group of investors, men who saw her as nothing more than a business arrangement. But her mind wasn't here. It was still back at that bar. Still trapped in the storm of Xavier's words. Not if I have anything to say about it. The way he had looked at her. The way his voice had dropped, low and possessive. She shouldn't have felt anything. But she did. And now, Xavier's words gnawed at her, sinking deeper into her thoughts like poison. Do you even know what kind of man my brother is? Her fingers trembled slightly around her champagne glass. Was there something she didn't know about Adrian? Excuse me for a moment, she murmured to Adrian. He glanced at her briefly but didn't question it. He was too busy discussing stock portfolios and business expansions. Elena turned on her heel and slipped away from the crowd, the noise fading behind her as she made her way down the dimly lit hallway of the Volkov estate. She had been here enough times to know her way around. She wasn't entirely sure where she was going, only that she needed to find him. Xavier. She found him outside on the terrace, standing near the edge, a cigarette balanced between his fingers. He didn't smoke often, but when he did, it usually meant something was weighing on his mind. The soft glow of the city lights bathed him in a silver hue, making him look even more untouchable. But he wasn't untouchable. Not to her. You left the party, she said softly. Xavier didn't turn to look at her. He simply took a slow drag of his cigarette before exhaling, the smoke curling into the cold night air. So did you? Elena took a hesitant step closer. Tell me what you meant earlier. Xavier finally turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Which part? You know which part. He studied her for a long moment as if deciding whether or not to tell her the truth. Then with a sigh he flicked the cigarette away, grinding it beneath his shoe. You shouldn't marry him, he said simply. Elena's hands curled into fists. You keep saying that, but you won't tell me why. Xavier's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Because you don't know him the way I do. Elena took another step forward, her frustration rising. Then tell me. Stop speaking in riddles, Xavier. Something shifted in his expression. And then finally he spoke. Adrian isn't the man you think he is, Elena. He's charming, polite, says all the right things, but that's all a facade. A cold weight settled in her stomach. What are you saying? Xavier exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. I've spent my whole life cleaning up his messes. He's reckless. Careless. And when things don't go his way, But he stopped himself. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. He what, Xavier? Xavier's eyes darkened. He doesn't take rejection well. Her breath hitched. Xavier turned away, gripping the stone railing of the terrace so tightly that his knuckles turned white. There have been women before you, he admitted, voice low. Women he's pursued. Women he's discarded the second he got bored. Elena shook her head, not wanting to believe it. That doesn't mean. He gets obsessed, Elena. Xavier's voice was sharp, cutting. And when he loses interest, he makes sure they disappear quietly. A chill ran down her spine. Disappear? What are you saying? She whispered. Xavier turned back to her, his expression unreadable. I'm saying that the last woman he got engaged to mysteriously broke it off and left the country. No one has heard from her since. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Well, that couldn't be true. Adrian was kind. Sweet. He had never once made her feel unsafe. But something in Xavier's face told her he wasn't lying. She swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this? Xavier's jaw clenched. Because I don't want to watch him ruin you too. The confession hit her like a tidal wave. For a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the party inside, muffled by the walls of the mansion. Then slowly Elena stepped closer. Why do you care? Xavier tensed. Her gaze searched his, looking for the truth. And then just for a split second she saw it. The emotion he had been trying so desperately to hide. The way he looked at her. The way he always looked at her. As if she was something he wanted but knew he couldn't have. You already know why, he said quietly. Her breath caught in her throat. This was dangerous. Being near him. Listening to him. Letting herself feel something for him. But God help her, she couldn't stop. Say it, she whispered. Xavier's expression hardened as if fighting himself. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You really want to hear it, Elena? She nodded. Xavier's hands clenched into fists at his sides. And then finally he broke. Because I don't want you to belong to him, he admitted, voice rough with something raw and unfiltered. Because the thought of you being his makes me go insane. Elena felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. Xavier let out a slow, heavy breath. And because no matter how much I try to fight it, I want you. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Elena knew she should say something, anything, but her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, of realizations crashing into her all at once. She had spent weeks convincing herself that this was nothing. That Xavier was just a complication. That she would marry Adrian and move forward with her life. But she had been lying to herself. Because the truth was she wanted him too. And that was the most dangerous realization of all. Neither of them moved. The tension between them was thick, unbearable. Then suddenly, a sound. A sharp click. They turned their heads just in time to see Adrian standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes told her everything. He had heard everything. And he was furious. Silence stretched across the terrace, thick and suffocating. Elena's heart pounded violently against her ribs as she locked eyes with Adrian. He stood in the doorway, his usually warm expression replaced with something unreadable. Something cold. Xavier didn't move. Neither did she. But Adrian. He stepped forward. Fully. Controlled. I must say, he murmured, his voice eerily calm, this is quite the conversation to walk in on. Elena's mouth went dry. Xavier, however, didn't flinch. How much did you hear? His tone was flat, unreadable. Adrian tilted his head, studying them both. Then a slow, humorless smile curved his lips. Enough. Elena felt her stomach twist. Adrian wasn't the type to raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who preferred slow, measured retaliation, one that cut deeper than a moment of anger ever could. He took another step closer, his eyes flickering between her and Xavier. I always knew you didn't approve, Adrian said, addressing his brother. But I never thought you'd be this desperate to sabotage my engagement. Xavier let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm protecting her. Adrian's smile faltered, his eyes darkening. Protecting her? From me. He laughed, but there was no amusement in it. That's rich coming from you. Xavier's expression remained cold. You don't love her, Adrian. And you do. Adrian's voice sharpened, and the question hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Xavier didn't answer. But the silence was the answer. Adrian exhaled harshly, running a hand through his dark hair. I should have known. You always had a habit of wanting things that weren't yours. Xavier's eyes darkened. Elena isn't a thing, Adrian. She's not some acquisition you can claim just because it benefits the family. Adrian's jaw clenched. She agreed to marry me. His gaze flicked to Elena, sharp and unreadable. Didn't you? Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. This was her moment. She could deny everything. She could brush off whatever had just happened between her and Xavier, tell Adrian what he wanted to hear and move forward. But she couldn't lie. Not anymore. I agreed to marry you because I had no other choice, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's expression hardened. Because of your father's company, he said flatly. He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Something flickered in his gaze. Something calculating. And what about now? He asked. Has that changed? Elena's lips parted, but before she could answer, Xavier stepped forward, his entire body taut with restrained fury. That's enough. Adrian arched his brow. I'm talking to her, brother. Xavier's hands curled into fists. And I'm telling you to back off. The air between them crackled with tension. Adrian exhaled slowly, shaking his head. This is disappointing. Elena frowned. Disappointing. Adrian's gaze flicked back to her, and for the first time she saw it. The shift. The mask slipped. I was willing to give you a good life, Elena, he said. I would have taken care of you. Protect you. But I don't need protection, she shot back. Adrian's smile didn't reach his eyes. Don't you? A shiver ran down her spine. There was something different in his tone now, something unsettling. Adrian had always been composed, always so perfectly in control. But now there was something off about him. And the worst part? Xavier had warned her. You don't take rejection well, do you? Xavier muttered, his voice laced with something dangerous. Adrian's gaze flickered to him, and for the briefest moment, there was something sharp in his expression. You've never understood me, Xavier. You think I'm some villain, don't you? Xavier didn't respond. Adrian exhaled, shaking his head. It doesn't matter. He turned his attention back to Elena, his voice smooth, calm, way too calm. You agreed to marry me. A deal is a deal. Elena stiffened. I'm not a contract, Adrian. His jaw ticked. No, he said softly. You're much more valuable than that. The way he said it sent a chill through her. Xavier must have noticed because he took a deliberate step between them, his broad frame blocking Adrian from view. You're done here, Xavier said. Adrian let out a soft chuckle. And what? You're going to save her? His gaze flicked over Xavier's shoulder, locking onto Elena. Do you want him to save you? Elena swallowed hard. Adrian's gaze burned into her, waiting, expecting her to fold. But she didn't. She lifted her chin, steeling herself. Yes. Adrian's expression went blank. For a moment she thought maybe she had imagined everything. The shift in his demeanor, the coldness creeping into his tone. But suddenly something changed. Adrian exhaled, slow and deliberate. Then he smiled. All right. Xavier frowned. All right. Adrian shrugged. If that's what she wants, then so be it. Elena's brows furrowed. Just like that. Adrian's smile never wavered. I'm not going to force someone to marry me, Elena. He glanced at Xavier, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Besides, I have a feeling this is far from over. Elena felt a shiver creep down her spine. Because something about the way he said it, so calm, so sure, that sent a silent warning through her. This wasn't over. Not even close. And the worst part? Adrian never lost. The silence after Adrian's departure was deafening. Elena stood frozen on the terrace, her pulse still racing as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She had expected anger, rage, something. But Adrian's response had been unnervingly calm. Too calm. Xavier's posture was still tense, his fists clenched at his sides as he stared at the doorway Adrian had walked through. The energy between them had shifted, no longer simmering tension, but something heavier. A storm waiting to break. You shouldn't have said that, Xavier muttered finally. Elena blinked, pulling herself from her thoughts. What? You shouldn't have told him you wanted me to save you. His jaw was clenched tight as if he was fighting something inside himself. A frown tugged at her lips. Why? It's the truth. Xavier exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. Elena, you don't know what you've just done. She crossed her arms. What have I done? You challenged him. His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the edge of frustration beneath it. Adrian doesn't let go of things easily. You think he's going to walk away just because you said you don't want him? A shiver ran through her. Xavier was right. Adrian never lost. Then what should I have done? She shot back. Lie. Pretend I want to marry him. Xavier turned to face her fully, his eyes dark with something unreadable. You should have been careful. Elena's chest tightened. Careful? You think I did this to be reckless? Xavier didn't answer. She let out a frustrated breath. You were the one who told me the truth about him, Xavier. You were the one who warned me. She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. Did you expect me to ignore everything you said? His throat bobbed. No, he admitted. His hands curled into fists again as if he was holding himself back. You just what? She pressed. Xavier exhaled, his gaze flickering over her face. Then suddenly he moved. 1 second there was space between them, and the next he had her pinned against the cold stone railing, his hands braced on either side of her. Her breath hitched. Xavier. You don't understand what kind of man Adrian is, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. She swallowed hard. Then tell me. Xavier's gaze burned into hers. He looked torn, like he was fighting himself, battling something deep inside. Then finally he spoke. When we were younger, Adrian always got what he wanted. Always, Xavier said, his voice laced with something bitter. Our father made sure of it. He was the golden son, the perfect heir. And I was the one who learned to clean up his messes. Elena stared at him, her pulse hammering. Mess like what? Xavier hesitated. There was another girl before you. Elena's stomach twisted. The one you told me about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier's jaw clenched. Yes. But there were others too. Women who thought they were special. Women who thought Adrian would love them. He exhaled sharply. Until he didn't. Her fingers dug into the railing. And what happened to them? Xavier's gaze flickered with something dark. The lucky ones left. She felt her blood run cold. The lucky ones, she repeated. Xavier didn't answer. He didn't have to. Elena's chest rose and fell rapidly. She had known deep down that something was off about Adrian, but hearing Xavier say it out loud made it real. Dangerously real. She had spent so much time believing that this engagement was nothing more than a business deal, something cold and calculated but ultimately harmless. She had been wrong. Adrian wasn't just possessive. He was dangerous. Her fingers trembled against the stone. Xavier, what do we do? The way she said we made something flicker across his face. But before he could fully process it, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the fragile silence. Xavier reacted instantly, stepping in front of her, his body tense, protective. Then the door to the terrace swung open. A man in a sharp suit, one of Adrian's assistants, stood there, his face expressionless. Miss Elena, he said smoothly, his gaze flickering to Xavier with a hint of something colder. Mr. Adrian has requested your presence in the ballroom. Elena's stomach twisted. Xavier's jaw locked. She's not going anywhere with you. The assistant's lips twitched, almost amused. I wasn't asking, Mr. Xavier. His gaze flickered back to Elena. It would be in your best interest to come. Elena's pulse pounded. She didn't trust this. But deep down she already knew if she didn't go, Adrian would make it worse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she glanced at Xavier. His expression was unreadable, but his entire body was coiled tight, like he was barely restraining himself from doing something reckless. She took a slow breath. "I'll go," she said quietly. Xavier's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with something dangerously close to panic. "Elena." She shook her head. "If I don't, he'll just escalate." Xavier didn't look convinced, but there was no time to argue. So she did the only thing she could. She stepped past him, following the assistant back inside. The ballroom was filled with people. Guests, business associates, even family members, all dressed in luxury, sipping expensive champagne under the soft glow of chandeliers. And at the center of it all, he stood at the front of the room, composed as ever, with a practiced smile on his lips. But Elena knew better. She knew what lurked beneath the surface. As she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. The whispering started almost immediately. Then Adrian's gaze met hers. And he smirked. "Ah, there she is," he said smoothly, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "My beautiful fiancé." Elena froze. "Fiancé?" The crowd responded exactly as he wanted, smiling, nodding, believing as he reached for her hand. Before she could react, before she could pull away, Adrian lifted her fingers to his lips, pressing a kiss against her skin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, his voice effortlessly commanding. "Tonight is not just a celebration, it is the beginning of something much greater. As many of you know, my family has always sought strength and unity, in building not just businesses but legacies." His eyes flickered to Elena, sharp and deliberate. "And that is why I am honored to introduce the woman who will stand beside me in the future. Elena is not just my bride-to-be, she is the future of what we are building. Together." Murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Adrian continued, his smirk barely hidden. "This is not just a union of two people, it is a statement. A promise. And I assure you nothing will come between it." Elena's stomach twisted. He was making it official. Not just to the guests, not just to her, but to Xavier. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the eyes on her. Everyone believed this was her choice, that she was standing beside Adrian willingly. And worst of all, she couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The morning after the gala should have been quiet. It should have been a moment of peace. Instead, it was a calculated performance. The Volkovs and Elena's family gathered in the grand dining hall, a long, polished table stretching between them. The sunlight poured through the towering windows, making the room feel deceptively warm. But beneath the civility there was tension, a quiet, dangerous tension that only a few at the table truly understood. Elena sat between her parents, her hands resting lightly on her lap, trying to keep her composure. Across from her, Adrian was effortlessly composed, sipping his black coffee like nothing had happened the night before. Like he hadn't trapped her. Like he hadn't just declared to the world that she belonged to him. At the head of the table, Dmitry Volkov, the powerful patriarch of the Volkov Empire, watched everything with a knowing gaze. He had the air of a man who had seen it all, and yet when he looked at Adrian, there was something else there. Pride. It was no secret that Dmitry favored Adrian. Because Adrian is Dmitry's real wife's son and the one he trusted with his empire. Xavier, meanwhile, sat at the other end of the table, deliberately distant. He was unreadable, his expression giving nothing away, but Elena could feel his anger beneath the surface. Unlike Adrian, he wasn't playing a game. He wasn't pretending. She knew him well enough to recognize the way his fingers curled slightly against the table, his jaw locked tight. And she hated it. She hated how much she noticed him. Hated that he was the only person at this table who had wanted her to be free. But she wasn't free. And Adrian was making sure everyone knew it. The conversation drifted between polite topics. The stock market, the upcoming merger, meaningless chatter that masked the unspoken truths between them all. Then Dmitry finally turned to Elena's father. "You must be relieved," he said smoothly, setting his fork down. "To know your daughter is in good hands." Elena's stomach twisted. Her father smiled tightly. Of course. This arrangement was always meant to be beneficial for both families. Adrian smirked. "And now there's no doubt about where we stand." Xavier's fork scraped against his plate. It was a small, almost insignificant sound. But to Elena it might as well have been gunfire. Dmitri turned toward him, finally acknowledging his presence. "You must be pleased as well, Xavier," his father said, though there was a cruel glint in his eyes. "To see your brother securing the future of this family." Xavier didn't even look up. "I think we all know Adrian is very good at securing things." Adrian chuckled, clearly unbothered. "You sound bitter, brother." "Just stating a fact," Xavier said coolly. Dmitri frowned slightly but said nothing more. He had never cared much for Xavier's opinions. Xavier had always been the other son. The one born from a marriage that was erased from history the moment his mother died. Elena clenched her fists beneath the table. He hated this. Hated watching Xavier being pushed aside like he didn't matter. Hated that Adrian was sitting there winning. And most of all, hated that there was nothing she could do about it. The moment breakfast was over, Elena made her way down the grand hall, her mind racing. She needed answers. And she needed them now. She found Adrian in one of the private sitting rooms, casually pouring himself a drink like he had all the time in the world. Like he hadn't just ripped her life away from her the night before. Elena stormed inside, slamming the door behind her. What the hell was that last night? Adrian didn't even flinch. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass before taking a slow sip, his lips curling into something almost amused. "I assume you're referring to our engagement announcement?" he said smoothly. Her chest tightened. "Ours? You mean yours?" Adrian sighed, setting the glass down. "Elena, do you really think I would let you walk away just like that?" "You said I could leave," she snapped, taking a step closer. "You told me I had a choice." Adrian smirked. "And you actually believed me?" Her breath hitched. His gaze darkened, the amusement fading into something sharper. Colder. "You don't seem to understand, Elena," he murmured, stepping toward her. "I don't lose." Her stomach twisted. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. She jerked away, but his hand barely faltered. "I gave you the illusion of freedom," he continued, his voice eerily soft. "I let you think you had a choice. But the truth." He leaned in just slightly, enough for her to feel the heat of his presence. "You were never going to leave me." Elena swallowed hard, her pulse thundering in her ears. "You're insane," she whispered. Adrian chuckled. "No. I'm strategic." She clenched her fists. Do you know why my father trusts me?" Adrian interrupted, his tone turning almost conversational. "Why did he choose me to carry this family forward?" He tilted his head, watching her like she was some fragile little thing before him. "Because I do what needs to be done. Unlike my dear brother." Elena's throat tightened. "This isn't about Xavier." Adrian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is about Xavier." She frowned. Adrian leaned closer, his voice lowering. "You think I don't know? That I don't see what's happening?" He chuckled darkly. "The way he looks at you. The way you look at him." Elena's entire body went still. Adrian smirked. "It's pathetic, really. Xavier wants to be me. He wants what I have, but he never will." Her stomach twisted violently. "That's not." "But don't worry, sweetheart," Adrian murmured, brushing his fingers against her jaw, his touch feather-light yet suffocating. "You will teach him that lesson for me." Her breath caught. "Because at the end of the day," Adrian whispered, his voice smooth as silk, "you will choose me. You won't have a choice." Elena's heart pounded. "I will never choose you." Adrian chuckled. "Oh, darling." He stepped back, watching her with a knowing smirk. "You already have." With that he turned, leaving her standing there, her world tilting dangerously off balance. He wanted to scream. Wanted to fight. But deep down she knew. Adrian was always 2 steps ahead. And if she didn't figure out how to stop him, he would win. He always did. Elena felt like she was suffocating. Adrian's words still clung to her skin, poisoning the air around her. "At the end of the day you will choose me. You won't have a choice." Her hands trembled as she walked through the Volkov estate, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The corridors were endless, cold, and unwelcoming, just like the man who ruled them. Adrian had won the public battle. But Elena refused to let him win her. He had to get out. But where would she go? Her parents were on Adrian's side. The entire business world believed she was his. And Adrian? He would never let her go. She needed a plan. A real one. And there was only one person she could turn to. Xavier. She found him in the garden, standing near the stone pathway lined with dark roses. His back was to her, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew she would come. Xavier, she whispered. He didn't turn immediately. His posture was rigid, his body locked in restraint. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. Do you regret it? He asked, his voice controlled, but there was something beneath it, something raw. Elena swallowed. Regret what? Siding with me. Last night. Her breath caught. I didn't side with you. Xavier's eyes darkened. I sided with myself, she clarified. Because for the first time, I realized that Adrian was never going to let me go. And if I don't do something, he's going to take everything from me. Xavier's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly, tilting his head as he studied her. You think I don't know that? Elena stepped closer, searching his face. Then why won't you fight him? Xavier scoffed. You think I haven't? She frowned. Do you know why I left this family for years, Elena? He said, his voice laced with quiet fury. Why did I build my own world, separate from my father's name? She had heard the whispers, of course. That Xavier Volkov had turned his back on the family business. That he had built something just as powerful but had always remained in the shadows. But no one ever spoke about why. Because I was never meant to win, he murmured. Elena's stomach twisted. My mother was his first wife, but I was never his first choice, Xavier continued, his voice quieter now. The day she died, I stopped being his son. And Adrian was the perfect heir. The one who did everything exactly as he was told. The one who never questioned. Elena watched the way his hands curled into fists. He has always won, Elena. Because my father made sure he would. She shook her head. You're wrong. Xavier's lips twitched. Am I? She exhaled sharply. Adrian wins because no one fights him, Xavier. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. But you could. Xavier stilled. You could stop him, she whispered. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. A possibility. A war waiting to begin. But just as quickly as it came, it was gone. I can't, he muttered. Why? Because it's too late. Elena's chest ached. You don't believe that. Xavier clenched his jaw, stepping back. I can't help you, Elena. The words hit harder than she expected. She stared at him, waiting for him to take it back. Waiting for him to prove her wrong. But he didn't. The walls were back up. He was pushing her away. Elena's throat tightened. She turned sharply, walking away before he could see the betrayal in her eyes. If Xavier wasn't going to help her, she would find another way. Later that night, the estate was quiet. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. It felt foreign. Like a shackle she couldn't remove. She had spent the entire day trying to come up with a plan, any plan, but no matter what she thought of, the same obstacle remained. He was too powerful. Too calculated. She needed leverage. Something that would make him back off permanently. A soft knock echoed at her door. Elena stiffened. Come in. The door opened slowly and her breath hitched. Xavier. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something different this time. Something unsettled. Elena rose to her feet. What are you? You were right, he cut in, his voice low. She blinked. Xavier exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. You were right, Elena. Adrian wins because no one fights him, and I'm done pretending. I'm done losing. She searched his face, her pulse hammering against her ribs. A storm brewed in his dark gaze, but beneath all the fury and defiance she saw something else, something raw. Something vulnerable. Slowly she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. You're not the only one who's done pretending, she whispered. Xavier stilled. Elena swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She hesitated, but then she forced herself to push through. I love you, Xavier. His breath hitched. She felt his body go rigid, his fists clenching at his sides, as if he were fighting some unseen battle within himself. I don't know when it happened, she continued, her voice shaking, but it did. And I know it's wrong and I know it's dangerous, but I love you. Not Adrian. I should have told you sooner. I should have said something the moment I knew, but She stopped when she saw the way his jaw clenched, his expression darkening, his body locked in restraint. Xavier was struggling. Fighting. Not against her. Against himself. Xavier, she whispered, her fingers grazing him. Tell me the truth. His breathing was uneven, his eyes conflicted, but she saw the answer before he even spoke. Still she needed to hear it. Do you love me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier closed his eyes. His throat bobbed, his hands shaking. Elena, he murmured, almost like a warning. Say it, she urged. Silence. Agonizing silence. I love you. The words left him in a hoarse whisper, like a confession dragged from the depths of his soul. Elena's breath caught. Xavier let out a shuddering exhale, his shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by something even heavier. He lifted a hand, hesitating for only a second before cupping her face. His thumb brushed over her cheek, his touch featherlight as if she might disappear. I've loved you since the moment I saw you, he admitted, his voice raw. And I have fought it every second since. Tears burned in Elena's eyes. Then stop fighting. Xavier's grip on her tightened, his forehead pressing against hers. I don't know how, he whispered. She smiled through the tears. Then let me show you. And just like that, he let go. Of the restraint. Of the fear. Of everything that told him to stay away. He kissed her. And nothing had ever felt more right. The kiss changed everything. Elena felt the world tilt, the weight of her choices pressing down on her, but none of it mattered in that moment. Not Adrian. Not the engagement. Not the war waiting outside the door. All that mattered was him. Xavier pulled away just enough for their breaths to mingle, his forehead still pressed against hers. His fingers trembled against her jaw as if he still couldn't believe she was real. But reality crashed in too soon. Because when she opened her eyes, she saw the flicker of something in his. Guilt. Xavier, she whispered. His jaw tightened. He took a step back, running a hand over his face. This isn't going to be easy, he muttered. Elena swallowed hard. I know. You don't, he said, his voice sharp. He turned away, exhaling harshly. Adrian isn't just going to let you go. He's dangerous, Elena. He knows what's going on between us. But if he gets to know what we did just now, then he won't just come for me, he'll come for you. We don't have a choice. Elena murmured. Silence stretched between them. Then Xavier sighed, stepping closer. He reached out, his fingers trailing down her arm before gripping her wrist. I need you to be careful, he murmured. Elena nodded, but she knew neither of them could afford to be careful anymore. They had started a fire. And Adrian was going to see the smoke soon. Elena barely slept that night, her mind a storm of tangled emotions. She had kissed Xavier. She had confessed her love, and for the first time, Xavier had stopped holding back. But the moment of bliss was already unraveling. The next morning, Elena stepped into the grand hall of the Volkov estate, her pulse a steady drum against her ribs. She didn't know how she knew, maybe it was the way the air felt thicker or the way the servants avoided her gaze, but she felt it. Adrian was waiting. She barely made it past the marble staircase before a hand shot out, gripping her wrist. She gasped as she was yanked into an empty corridor, her back colliding with the cold stone wall. His grip was tight but not bruising. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of something deadly. Did you think I wouldn't find out? His voice was smooth, but there was venom beneath it. Elena stiffened. Adrian tilted his head, studying her. You're not even going to deny it? She forced herself to breathe. Why should I? His lips curved into something that almost resembled amusement. Almost. Because fiancé, he murmured, his grip tightening just slightly. I don't take betrayal lightly. Elena swallowed, willing herself not to react. She had known this moment was coming. She just hadn't expected it so soon. Adrian leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Do you think he can protect you? A shiver ran down her spine. Adrian chuckled softly, darkly. I see the way you look at him. The way he looks at you. You're both fools if you thought I wouldn't notice. Elena clenched her fists. Then why are you still pretending? Adrian's brows lifted slightly. You don't love me, she said, forcing the words out steadily. You never did. This engagement is about power. Control. Not me. Adrian's gaze darkened. You want me because you don't want him to have me, she continued, voice barely above a whisper. That's all this is. His fingers trailed up her wrist before he released her completely, stepping back. Maybe, he admitted. But does it matter? Elena stared at him. Adrian smirked. You still belong to me. She hated the way her breath hitched. The way his words sank deep into her skin like poison. You won't win, she whispered. Adrian exhaled, shaking his head. Elena, he murmured, almost like he was amused. I already have. And then he was gone. Xavier knew. He knew. The moment he saw Adrian pull Elena away, something inside him snapped. He had spent years holding himself back, years walking the fine line between control and destruction, but now? That line had vanished. He stormed through the estate, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He found Adrian in the study, casually pouring himself a drink like he hadn't just threatened the woman Xavier loved. Xavier didn't hesitate. He slammed the glass out of Adrian's hand. It shattered against the floor, the whiskey spilling like blood. Adrian sighed, glancing at the mess. That was expensive. Xavier grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the bookshelf. Stay away from her. Adrian's smirk didn't waver. That's funny coming from you. Xavier's grip tightened. I swear to God. Or what? Adrian cut in, voice dripping with amusement. You'll fight me? Take what's mine. He let out a slow chuckle. You really think you can win? Xavier didn't blink. I know I can. Adrian's smirk faltered just for a second. And Xavier saw it. The fear. She doesn't belong to you, Xavier said, his voice steady. And I won't let you touch her again. Adrian tilted his head. What makes you think she won't come back to me on her own? Xavier's jaw clenched. Adrian leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. She's scared of me, Xavier, he murmured. You think she'll choose you when it really matters? Xavier froze. Adrian chuckled. You know she's scared. That's why you're shaking, isn't it? Xavier stepped back, releasing him with a shove. Adrian straightened his suit, smoothing out the wrinkles. You're out of your depth, brother, he said. Walk away before it's too late. Xavier didn't respond. He didn't trust himself either. Instead, he turned and walked out. But he wasn't giving up. No, this wasn't over. Not even close. Because Adrian had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated him. And Xavier was going to make sure he regretted it. Elena stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were shadowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The conversation with Adrian replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. His voice, his threats, the certainty in his smirk when he said she belonged to him. Her fingers curled into fists. No, she wasn't his. She never was. A knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. She turned just as Xavier stepped inside, his expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. He knew. Did he hurt you? Xavier's voice was sharp, controlled, but beneath it she heard the barely restrained fury. Elena exhaled slowly. Not physically. Xavier's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, scanning her face as if he needed to be sure. What did he say to you? Elena hesitated. He knows, she admitted, voice soft but firm. About us. About everything. Xavier cursed under his breath, raking a hand through his hair. I should have stopped him last night. I should have. You did, she interrupted, stepping forward. You chose me, Xavier. And I chose you. His breath caught. She lifted a hand, placing it against his chest. Beneath his shirt, his heartbeat was wild, erratic. He's going to come for me, she whispered. Xavier covered her hand with his own, holding it tightly. Then let him. His voice was steel. I won't let him take you from me. Elena swallowed hard. Xavier exhaled sharply. Adrian doesn't just want to control you. He wants to control everything. He's going to attack from every angle. And he did. Because the next morning, Elena's father's business took a hit. News broke that his company was facing financial instability, board members were pulling out, and stock prices were plummeting. Elena sat frozen at the breakfast table, watching her father grip his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Someone leaked our financial reports, her father muttered. Our investors are panicking, Someone. Oh. Elena knew exactly who it was. She caught Xavier's gaze across the table. His entire body was tense, his jaw locked. He wasn't coming for her. He was coming for her family. And then, just to drive the dagger deeper, Adrian arrived. Firking. Sitting down as if he wasn't responsible for the storm raging around them. Elena could barely breathe as he poured himself a drink, turning to her father. I heard about the crisis, Adrian said smoothly. It's unfortunate, but there's a solution. Her father stiffened. What are you suggesting? Adrian's eyes flickered to Elena, dark amusement dancing in them. We move forward with the engagement. The air in the room turned ice cold. Elena's stomach twisted. He was playing his final card. If the wedding date is announced officially, the market will see it as a strategic business move. Investors will regain confidence. The stock will stabilize, Adrian continued. You won't lose your company. He leaned back, watching her. Waiting. Her father hesitated. His company was everything. His pride, his life's work. Elena, he said slowly. You should think about this. Oh. She wouldn't let Adrian win. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Excuse me, she said sharply, turning away before her father could say another word. She needed to breathe. She needed Xavier. She found him outside, his back against the stone railing of the balcony, his shoulders taut with tension. You heard, she asked softly. Xavier let out a bitter laugh. He's predictable. Elena stepped closer. What do we do? For the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Resignation. Elena's stomach dropped. Xavier. He turned toward her. I can end this, Elena. Her heart pounded. How? Xavier exhaled slowly. I'll make a deal with him. Elena frowned. What kind of deal? Xavier's hands curled into fists. I give up everything. My shares. My stake in the company. My financial backing. I walk away from all of it. Her breath caught. Xavier, no. It's the only way, he said firmly. He won't back down, but if I'm out of the picture he won't need to hold on to you anymore. I'll make sure your father's company is safe. Adrian will have to leave you alone. Her vision blurred. He was willing to lose everything. For her. Xavier, you can't. His fingers grazed her jaw. I can. And I will. Tears burned her eyes. She grabbed his wrist. No, wait. I have an idea. Xavier frowned, about to argue, but she stepped closer, her grip tightening. He wins because people let him win, she said fiercely. But if we both really fight, we can stop him. Xavier searched her face. Then slowly his expression changed. Hope. We have one chance to stop him for good, she said. You said it yourself. Adrian wants control over everything. If we take that from him, he loses. Not just me. Everything. Xavier frowned. But we need proof, she interrupted. Of his corruption. Of what he's done behind closed doors. Xavier exhaled sharply. That's not easy. Adrian covers his tracks too well. Then we find the one person who knows where the bodies are buried, she murmured. Xavier's eyes darkened. Then slowly he nodded. That night Xavier made a call. Not to a business associate. Not to a friend. To a ghost from Adrian's past. Viktor Mikhailov. The man Adrian had double-crossed years ago. The same man who had once been Adrian's closest ally until greed turned them into enemies. Xavier met him in secret, deep in the city's underground, where whispers held more power than money. Viktor smirked when he saw Xavier. I was wondering when you'd crawl out from under your brother's shadow. Xavier didn't rise to the bait. I need information. Viktor raised a brow. And what makes you think I'd give it to you? Because it's about Adrian. That caught his interest. Viktor leaned back, swirling his drink. I assume you're looking for something specific? Xavier's jaw clenched. His offshore accounts. Illegal trade deals. The politicians he's bought. Everything he's been keeping under the rug. Viktor whistled. That's a tall order, Volkov. Why should I help you? Xavier's grip on the phone tightened. Because if Adrian falls, there will be a shift in power. You and I both know it. Viktor chuckled. And you're offering me what? A front row seat to the show. Xavier's voice was calm, calculated. I'm offering you a stake in the Volkov empire. The line went silent for a beat. Victor hummed in amusement. Now that's interesting. Adrian would rather slit his own throat than let me get my hands on anything Volkov owned. Xavier leaned against the wall, his tone unreadable. That's exactly why I'm calling you. Once Adrian goes down, someone has to take over his shares, his connections, his resources. Victor exhaled, clearly intrigued. And you don't want it? Xavier's expression darkened. I don't want what Adrian built. I don't need it. There was another pause, then a slow chuckle. You're a dangerous man, Xavier Volkov. You have no idea. Victor clicked his tongue. All right, I'll bite. But I need more than promises. I need something concrete. Xavier pulled a flash drive from his pocket, staring at the data he had gathered over the years. Transactions, hidden accounts, backdoor dealings Adrian thought no one knew about. You'll have it by morning, Xavier said smoothly. Enough evidence to make Adrian bleed. You help me bring him down and I make sure you're the one left standing. Victor's laughter was low, sharp. Damn. You really want him gone, don't you? Xavier's jaw clenched. More than you know. Fine, Victor finally said. Send me what you have. And in return I'll do what I do best, destroy Adrian from the inside out. Xavier's grip on the phone loosened slightly. Then we have a deal. A smirk was evident in Victor's tone. I never thought I'd see the day. Tell me, Xavier, what's in this for you? Xavier glanced out the window, his eyes dark with determination. Freedom. Victor hummed. And the girl. A muscle ticked in Xavier's jaw. You know about her? A chuckle left from his mouth. I keep a track on everyone. So she's yours. Yes. She's mine. And just like that, the first domino fell. The next morning the headlines broke. Adrian Volkov caught in corruption scandal, illegal business dealings exposed. Volkov family feud. Tension rises as insider exposes CEO's dark secrets. Adrian's empire cracked. And he knew who was behind it. By the time he stormed into the estate that evening, Xavier was already waiting for him. You're awfully quiet, Xavier mused as Adrian slammed the door shut behind him. Not so smug now, are you? Adrian's nostrils flared. You think this is over? You know our entire empire is at stake. If I lost, then you lost too. All this because of her? Is she worth losing everything for? Xavier tilted his head. No. But I think you lost the most and she's worth more than you'll ever understand. Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it, but his tone was venomous. You're a fool, Xavier. You always have been. You think you've won. Xavier smirked, but there was no amusement in his eyes. I don't think Adrian. I know. Adrian's face darkened. Because for the first time in his life, he had lost. And Xavier had won. Adrian's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Xavier stood across from him, his expression calm but unyielding. The tension in the room was suffocating. The news had already spread like wildfire. Adrian's empire was crumbling. The board members were already in chaos, scrambling to distance themselves from him. His name was tarnished, his credibility destroyed. No. Xavier was here to take what was rightfully his. You underestimated me, Xavier continued, stepping closer. You always have. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. Please. You're just nothing. A mistake. You don't belong here. Xavier tilted his head. And yet here I am. While you're losing everything. Adrian's sneer faltered for just a second, but Xavier caught it. You thought you could control everyone. Manipulate them. Threaten them into submission, Xavier continued. But you forgot something. Adrian narrowed his eyes. Xavier smirked. Fear only works when people have something to lose. And Adrian? He had already lost. Xavier had made sure of it. You don't get to decide how this ends, Xavier said. Not anymore. Adrian's jaw tightened. The board will never let you take over. Xavier's smirk deepened. Won't they? As if on cue, the door swung open and several men in tailored suits entered. The Volkov board members. Adrian paled. Mr. Volkov, one of them said, but not to Adrian. To Xavier. Elena sucked in a quiet breath. This was it. As you know, the man continued, given the recent exposure of Adrian's illegal activities, the board has convened for an emergency vote. Adrian took a sharp step forward. You can't. We can, The man cut him off sharply. The decision had already been made. Xavier was taking over. Effective immediately, the man continued. Adrian Volkov is removed as CEO of Volkov Industries. Silence. Elena saw it. For the first time in his life, Adrian Volkov looked powerless. Defeated. Xavier's lips curled into something unreadable. Looks like your reign is over, brother. Adrian turned to him, fury simmering beneath the surface. Do you think this changes anything? Adrian hissed. You think you'll be better than me? Xavier's gaze was cold. I already am. Adrian exhaled sharply, stepping back. His fists were still clenched, but the truth had finally sunk in. He had lost. Completely. Finally, Elena watched as Adrian stormed out, his footsteps heavy with anger. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of him anymore. The second the door slammed shut, she turned to Xavier. He was staring at her, something unreadable in his expression. It's over, he murmured. Elena stepped forward. Her heart was pounding not from fear, but from everything else. She reached up, cupping his face. You did it. Xavier exhaled, leaning into her touch. We did it. Elena smiled, warmth flooding through her. Xavier's fingers brushed against her waist, pulling her closer. Now. He smirked. Now I get to keep my promise. Elena frowned. Which promise? Xavier's gaze softened. To keep you safe. Her heart stuttered. Because she finally realized. Xavier wasn't just protecting her from Adrian. He was protecting her from a future she never wanted. He was giving her a choice. And she had already made it. Elena lifted herself onto her toes, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. Xavier inhaled sharply before pulling her against him, his hands steady, strong, his. For the first time in years, everything felt right. Because they weren't just surviving anymore. They won together and had their happily ever after. Think.